The morning Joel Donovan was hired to haul Bessie Fairchild's belongings out of Caldwell, Kansas. The sky was the color of a bruise, and the wind off the prairie smelled like rain that never came. He had been leaning against the post of Garvey's Feed and Supply when the notice was pinned to the board outside $3 to load a woman's furniture and personal effects onto a flatbed wagon and drive them 6 miles east to the rail depot in Harper County, where they would be loaded onto a westbound freight car and shipped somewhere Bessie Fairchild was determined to go, away from this town and everything in it. Joel needed the $3 badly enough that he pulled the notice off the board before the ink was fully dry. He was 26 years old that summer of 1882, with sun-darkened hands and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 4 days, and a reputation in Caldwell that was decent enough. He was known as a man who hauled freight, fixed fences, and never started trouble, though he had finished a fair share of it. He was not the sort of man who questioned a job. He loaded his 2-horse team, a pair of steady roan mares named Cora and Dust, and he drove them down the main street toward the address written on the notice, 14 Sycamore Lane, the eastern edge of town, where the houses grew smaller and the yards grew wider and the wind had more room to bully a person. He did not expect what he found there. The house at 14 Sycamore Lane was white, or had been once. The paint had peeled back in places like the skin of something that had been in the sun too long, and the front porch had a broken rail that leaned at a sad angle toward the dirt yard. But the flower beds along the front walk were immaculate deep red dahlias and yellow prairie sunflowers planted in straight, careful rows, and the dirt around them had been freshly turned, as if someone had been on their knees among them that very morning. Joel noticed the flowers because they were so deliberate, so cared for, and they did not match the general air of departure that hung around the rest of the property. Stacked on the porch were 3 trunks, 2 wooden crates, a rocking chair with a quilt folded over its arm, a hat box, and a bird cage with no bird in it. Everything was tied or wrapped or secured with careful attention. Whatever else was happening in Bessie Fairchild's life, she was a woman who packed her things properly. Joel climbed down from the wagon bench and knocked on the front door. He heard movement inside, the sound of heels on wooden floors, and then the door opened. Bessie Fairchild was 24 years old, and she had the kind of face that made a man forget what he had been about to say. Not because she was the most conventionally pretty woman he had ever seen, though she was striking enough with her dark chestnut hair pinned up in a loose knot at the back of her head, and her green eyes that had a quality like light through creek water. It was more the expression she wore, composed and resolute on the surface, but underneath that composure, something that looked very much like grief being held firmly in place by sheer willpower. She was dressed practically in a brown traveling skirt and a cream-colored blouse with the sleeves already rolled to the elbow, and she was holding a dishcloth in both hands as if she had just been drying something. "You are the hauler," she said. It was not a question. "Joel Donovan," he said, taking off his hat. "I have a flatbed and 2 good horses. I can have everything loaded in under an hour." She looked past him at the wagon and the mares, and something in her expression shifted just briefly, just a flicker, something that might have been doubt or might have been sadness, and then it was gone. "Good," she said. "I will pay you when we reach the depot. The trunks are heavy. I would appreciate if you handled them with care." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She stepped back inside without another word, and Joel got to work. He loaded the trunks first, working methodically, testing the weight before he lifted, using a plank from the wagon bed as a ramp for the heaviest one. It took both of them to get the biggest trunk down the porch steps. Bessie appeared at his elbow without being asked, taking hold of the rope handle on her end and matching him stride for stride without complaint. She was stronger than she looked. He noted that too. As he loaded the crates, she brought out 2 more small items, a framed photograph wrapped in muslin cloth, and a painted tin box that she placed in the birdcage, and set on top of the rocking chair with the kind of deliberate care that told him they mattered more than the trunks. "Is there anything else inside?" he asked. She stood on the porch and looked back through the open door at the empty rooms beyond. Floors were swept. The curtains were still on the windows. She had not taken the curtains. "No," she said. "That is everything." She pulled the door shut and locked it and dropped the key into her skirt pocket, and Joel watched her stand there for just a moment with her hand on the door, not quite ready to turn away, and he did not say anything because he recognized that particular kind of stillness. He had stood that way himself once in front of a different house, in a different town, years ago. He knew you had to give a person time to finish saying goodbye to a place, even if you were the only one who knew you were doing it. Then she turned, stepped off the porch, and climbed up to the wagon bench before he had a chance to offer her a hand. She settled her skirts and looked straight ahead down the lane toward the main road. Joel climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue at Cora and Dust. The wagon rolled forward, and the house at 14 Sycamore Lane fell away behind them. They traveled in silence down the main street of Caldwell, past the saloon and the bank and the dry goods store and the barber shop, and Joel kept his eyes on the road because it was not his business to look at the people who looked at Bessie. But he was aware of them. A few men on the boardwalk turned to watch the wagon pass. A woman in a blue dress coming out of the millinery shop stopped dead on the step and watched with her hand pressed flat against the front of her dress. A group of men outside the land office talked low to one another, and at least one of them laughed, and Joel felt Bessie go rigid beside him, just for a second, her spine straightening another fraction of an inch. He did not like what he was seeing, but he kept his mouth shut and drove his team because it was not his business. They cleared the end of Main Street and hit the open road east, and the prairie opened up around them, flat and enormous and golden with late summer grass, the horizon so far away it seemed like the edge of the world. A meadowlark sang somewhere off to the left. The wagon wheels made a low, continuous rumble on the packed dirt road. They were maybe half a mile out of town when Bessie spoke. "You can go a little faster if you like," she said. "The horses seem willing." "They are," he said. "But there is no hurry if you do not want there to be." She looked at him sidelong at that. He was watching the road, so he only caught it in his peripheral vision, a look that was half suspicious and half something he could not name. "What does that mean?" she asked. "Nothing particular," he said. "Just that I am being paid for the job, not for the speed. We go whatever pace suits you." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the prairie grass and made a sound like something breathing. "Nobody in this town has asked me what suits me in a very long time," she said, and she said it in a way that was not self-pitying, just factual, and somehow that made it worse. Joel pulled the reins gently, and Cora and Dust slowed to an easy walk. Bessie looked at him. "I said faster." "You said you could go faster," he corrected. "You did not say you wanted to." She opened her mouth, closed it, and then looked away to the left, out across the prairie, and he thought he heard something, not quite a laugh, but the ghost of one. Then she said quietly, "You are a peculiar kind of man, Mr. Donovan." "I have been told," he said. Another half-mile passed. The road curved slightly south around a dry creek bed lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves silver and trembling in the wind. A red-tailed hawk circled high overhead, riding a thermal with its wings spread wide and motionless. "My husband died 14 months ago," Bessie said suddenly, without preamble, without looking at him. "His name was Robert Fairchild. He was a decent man, and he left me the house and a small amount of savings, and the town has never quite forgiven me for still being alive and in the house without him." Joel said nothing. He let her talk. "They tolerated me for a while," she continued, "while I was suitably grief-stricken. But I stopped being suitably grief-stricken after about 6 months, which is apparently the amount of time a widow is allotted before she is expected to either remarry immediately or become invisible. I chose neither, and that was my great offense." She paused. "I kept the flower beds, I kept the house, I kept selling the preserves I had always sold to the general store. I remained exactly who I had been before, which, as it turns out, was unacceptable to a great many people." "And so you are leaving," Joel said. "I am leaving," she agreed. I have a cousin in Colorado Territory. She has a farm. I have corresponded with her for the last 3 months, and she has offered me a room and useful work, and that is more than Caldwell has offered me in 14 months, so yes, I am leaving. Joel held the reins easy in his hands and thought about that. He thought about the key she had dropped in her pocket, and the curtains she had left on the windows, and the way she had stood at the door saying goodbye to a house that had also been a kind of grief. He thought about what kind of town watches a woman leave and laughs. He had made it exactly half a mile past the edge of town. He pulled back on the reins. Cora and Dust stopped, stamping their feet in mild protest, and Joel sat there on the bench with the reins loose in his hands and stared at the road ahead of him, 5.5 miles of it still stretching east toward the depot. Bessie looked at him. "Why have we stopped?" He did not answer right away. He was having an argument with himself that he suspected he had already lost. He was thinking about $3, which he needed. He was thinking about what was any of his business. He was thinking about the look on her face when she had turned from the door, and the way she had climbed onto the wagon bench without waiting for help, and the way she had said that nobody had asked what suited her in a very long time. He was thinking about a woman who planted flowers in straight, careful rows and left the curtains on the windows of a house she was giving up. He turned the wagon around. Bessie made a sound somewhere between indignation and alarm. "Mr. Donovan, the depot is east, or turning west." "I am aware," he said. "You are going back toward town. I am aware of that too. I am paying you to take me to the depot," she said, her voice taking on an edge. "If you have changed your mind about the work, you can simply say so and I will find another." "I have not changed my mind about the work," he said, guiding the team carefully on the road until they were facing back toward Caldwell, the grain elevators visible in the distance. "I have changed my mind about the destination." She stared at him. "I beg your pardon. You said you are leaving because the town has made your life miserable and you have a cousin in Colorado." He kept his eyes on the road. "But you left your curtains on the windows." A beat of silence. "What does that have to do with anything?" "It means you are not sure," he said. "Or at least you were not sure this morning when you packed." Her voice went very quiet and very controlled. "Mr. Donovan, I did not hire you for your opinion on my curtains." "No," he agreed. "But you are getting it anyway at no additional charge." Another silence, longer this time. He could feel her working herself up to something and he braced for it. And then instead of the sharp words he expected, she said, very quietly, "Stop the wagon." He stopped the wagon. They were sitting in the middle of the road between a half-mile of open prairie in both directions, the wind moving around them and the hawk still circling above, and Bessie Fairchild turned on the bench to look at him fully for the first time since they had left the house. "Tell me what you think you know about me," she said. "In plain terms. Because if you are going to interrupt my departure based on a notion about curtains, I believe you owe me a clear accounting." He turned and looked at her then, and when their eyes met, he felt something shift in his chest, something that had been settled and unmoved for years, like a stone in a riverbed that gets dislodged by a current that was always there but never quite strong enough until now. "I think you are a woman who put enormous care into a life in that house," he said. "And I think the town ran you off by being small and mean about it. And I think you are leaving not because you want to go to Colorado, but because you cannot figure out how to stay with dignity. And I think those are different things, and they are worth knowing the difference between." She held his gaze for a long moment. The wind moved her hair, loosening a strand that curved across her cheek, and she did not push it back. Her green eyes were very bright, and he thought for a moment she might say something devastating or might cry or might tell him to go to the devil, and instead she said, "And what do you propose to do about it?" He had not thought that far ahead. He said so. "I am working that out," he said honestly. "That is extraordinarily unhelpful," she said. "Yes," he agreed. But she did not tell him to turn the wagon back around. She sat there beside him in the middle of the road with her hands folded in her lap and the birdcage rattling softly in the back of the wagon, and after a moment she let out a long breath through her nose and said, My cousin Vera is a good woman. She genuinely meant her offer. Then she will understand if you write to tell her you need a little more time, Joel said. Bessie looked at the road ahead back toward Caldwell, and her expression was complicated pride and apprehension, and something like a stubborn, unwilling hope all folded together. I have no money to keep the house, she said quietly. The savings are nearly gone. I have the preserves, but the general store has cut my order in the last 2 months. I believe Mr. Harwick told them not to carry my goods. Harwick, Joel said. He knew the name. Augustus Harwick owned the largest parcel of land on the south side of Caldwell and considered himself the unofficial arbiter of who mattered and who did not in this town. Joel had butted heads with him before, briefly and memorably, over a hauling contract that Harwick had revoked for no stated reason 2 years prior. He wanted to buy my house, Bessie said. After Robert died, he made an offer within 3 weeks of the funeral which tells you everything about the man's sense of decency. I declined. He has been making my life difficult in small ways ever since. Joel let that settle. He understood the shape of the situation now. A powerful man with a grudge and the social leverage to make one woman's life steadily unbearable, and a woman too principled and too tired to keep fighting something that had no clear front line. It was a common enough story in small western towns in 1882, where a few men held disproportionate power and wielded it with the pettiness of people who had never been checked. He looked at the wagon bench beside him, at Bessie's folded hands and straight back and the strand of hair the wind kept insisting on, and he made a decision that surprised him more than it probably should have. I am going back to town, he said, not to return you to a situation you are trying to escape, but because I think there are things worth trying before you hand Harwick the satisfaction of watching you go. She looked at him with narrowed eyes. And what things would those be? I know every merchant on the main street, he said. I have hauled freight and goods for most of them. I have done honest work in this town for 4 years, and I am owed some goodwill. I think it is time I spent some of it. You would do that, she said slowly, for a woman you met an hour ago. I would do it, he said, because it is right, and also because I am curious about what you are like when you are not leaving. She looked at him for a long, searching moment, and then she said, with a caution that was the first honest thing she had let him see, "You should know that I am not an easy woman to be in the vicinity of. I have opinions and I state them, and I make preserves at odd hours when I cannot sleep, and I plant things in straight lines because diagonal rows offend me, and I do not pretend to find things funny that are not funny." Those all sound like qualities, he said. Most men do not find them so, she said. Most men, he said carefully, are not me. She held his gaze and then slowly, deliberately, she turned forward on the bench and looked at the road ahead, the road back toward Caldwell, toward the town that had been making her life small and mean and exhausting. If this does not work, she said, I want it noted that I had already made very sensible arrangements and you disrupted them. Noted, he said. He clicked his tongue, and Cora and Dust leaned into their traces, and the wagon rolled back toward town. He drove her back to 14 Sycamore Lane first. Together they unloaded her things from the wagon, the trunks, the crates, the rocking chair, the hat box, the bird cage with the painted tin box inside it. They carried them back up the porch steps and through the front door, and Bessie walked through the empty rooms in silence for a moment, her heels quiet on the swept wooden floors, the afternoon light coming through the curtain she had not taken, and Joel stood in the doorway and watched her stand in the center of the main room with her arms at her sides and her eyes closed and her face doing something he did not have a word for. Then she opened her eyes and they were clear and she said, "Right. Put the kettle on, would you? The kitchen is through there. I need to write 2 letters." He found the kitchen, found the stove, found the kettle and a water pail beside the back door, and he put the water on to boil while she sat at the small table in the main room with writing paper and an ink pen, and he listened to the scratch of the pen and the sound of the wind in the sycamore trees outside, and thought about what exactly he had done, and whether it was the most impulsive or the most sensible thing he had done in several years. He had not fully resolved the question by the time the water boiled. She drank tea with 2 spoons of sugar and no milk, which she told him with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had given up waiting for people to ask. He drank his plain, and they sat at the table while she finished her letters, one to Vera explaining that she was delaying her departure and would write again in 2 weeks, and one to the general store in Harper County that she had been supplying before Harwick's interference, inquiring whether they would take a new standing order for her preserves. "That is a start," he said, reading the letter to the general store over her shoulder, and then apologizing for reading over her shoulder because it was presumptuous, and she told him not to apologize for showing interest. She found it preferable to indifference. The following morning, Joel presented himself at the door of Caldwell's second-largest dry goods store, Meller's Emporium, and spoke with Carl Meller for 20 minutes. He did not threaten or posture. He simply pointed out, in the plainest possible terms, that Bessie Fairchild's preserves were the best-selling item Mellers had stocked 2 years running before the order was quietly dropped, and that Harwick's personal antipathy toward a widow woman was not a good enough reason for Carl Meller to cut off a product his customers asked for regularly. Carl Meller was a practical man and not particularly a cruel one, and when separated from Harwick's influence, he was easily enough reasoned with. He agreed to take 12 jars of preserves on a trial basis and to expand the order if they sold, which Joel knew they would. He went to 2 more establishments that day, and by the end of the week, Bessie had standing orders with 3 merchants in Caldwell and 1 in a neighboring town, and her kitchen smelled perpetually of peaches and blackberries and the sharp sweetness of hot sugar. Joel found himself in that kitchen more often than could be entirely accounted for by professional obligation. He told himself he was in the vicinity because he had taken on a secondary job repairing the fence along the east side of Fairchild's property, which was true, and which Bessie had accepted after 2 days of polite argument during which she insisted she could pay him, and he insisted the fence needed to be fixed regardless of payment, and they compromised on the understanding that she would feed him supper on the evenings he worked late. Those suppers became the finest hours of his day. She cooked the way she planted flowers precisely, and with more care than most people gave the task. She made biscuits that rose light and golden, and she made a chicken stew with sage that he was still thinking about 3 days after the first time she served it, and she made peach preserves that she put on everything, including the cornbread, which he had been skeptical of until he tasted it and was immediately converted. She talked at supper the way she had talked on the wagon bench, without performance, without the social softening that most women in 1882 employed as a survival strategy. She said what she thought. She had opinions about the railroad expansion, about the land grant policies that were pushing smaller homesteaders off their claims, about the treatment of the Comanche and Kiowa peoples whose land this had been not so many years before, and she stated her opinions with the calm authority of someone who had thought them through, and was not interested in being talked out of them by someone who had not. Joel found this extraordinary. He had not, in his 26 years, met a woman who talked to him the way Bessie talked to him, as an equal, as someone whose intelligence was assumed rather than tested, as someone she was genuinely interested in rather than performing interest for. He said something of this one evening, clumsily and not quite right, and she looked at him with an expression that was almost amused. "I talk to you this way because you listen," she said. "Most people do not listen. They wait for their turn to speak. You actually listen." "You say interesting things," he said. "It would be wasteful not to listen." She looked at him across the supper table, and the lamplight was warm and golden, and it caught in her dark hair and made the green of her eyes very vivid, and she said, "You are not what I expected when I opened the door and saw a hauler with a flatbed wagon." "What did you expect?" he asked. "Someone who would load my things and drive me east and take his $3 and not give me another thought," she said. "I thought about doing that," he admitted. "But you turned the wagon around," she said. "Half a mile out," he said. I made it exactly half a mile." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. Then she said, "I am glad you did. I would not have said so at the time, but I am glad." He looked back at her and felt that thing in his chest again, the stone in the riverbed, displaced by water that was patient and persistent, and had been waiting for exactly this moment to be strong enough. "I am glad, too," he said. The trouble with Augustus Harwick did not resolve itself simply because Bessie had new orders for her preserves. A man like Harwick was not accustomed to being circumvented, and when he noticed that Bessie Fairchild was still in her house on Sycamore Lane, and that Carl Meller was carrying her goods in his store, he was displeased in the way that powerful men are displeased when something they considered settled turns out not to be. The first sign of renewed trouble came on a Thursday afternoon in late August, when Joel was replacing the last of the fence posts along the east boundary of the Fairchild property. He heard the creak of a wagon and looked up to see a man he knew by sight, Dern Calloway, who worked for Harwick's operation, driving slow past the front of the lane and watching the house with a deliberate, assessing quality that Joel did not like at all. He set down his post driver and walked to the front of the property and stood there in plain sight until Calloway's wagon had passed and turned the corner. Then he went inside and told Bessie what he had seen. She was at the stove with her sleeves rolled and a wooden spoon in her hand, and she did not stop stirring when he told her, which told him she was not entirely surprised. "Harwick is not a man who accepts inconvenience gracefully," she said. "He will do something. I do not know what, but he will do something." "Has he threatened you directly?" Joel asked. "Not in words," she said. "He came to see me about the house again 4 months ago. He was very polite. He said he was concerned about a woman alone on the edge of town and that he would be happy to help me find a more suitable situation if I wished to sell. He said it very kindly, the way men say things kindly when they mean them as warnings." Joel sat down at the kitchen table and thought about this. He thought about the shape of a man like Harwick, wealthy, connected, accustomed to getting what he wanted by indirect pressure, not the kind of man who would do anything openly violent but very capable of making a person's life systematically difficult. "He wants the land," Joel said. "He wants everything on this side of the creek," Bessie said. "He has bought up 4 properties in the last 3 years. Mine is the last one he does not have. And Robert did not sell. Robert would not have sold it to him if Harwick had offered him 10 times its worth," Bessie said, and there was something in her voice when she said her husband's name, not raw grief anymore, but the quiet tenderness of a finished love, honored and set carefully down. "Robert knew what the land meant. He homesteaded it himself in 1874. It is good land." "It is," Joel said. He had repaired enough of the fencing and worked enough of the yard to know the property well by now. It had a creek tributary at the far southern edge and deep, dark soil that would grow about anything you put in it. It was worth exactly as much as Harwick thought it was. "I am not selling," Bessie said, still stirring. "I want to say that plainly so it is clear. I was leaving because I was exhausted and frightened and I could not see any way to hold on, but I am not frightened of him. I am tired of him, which is different." Joel looked at her back, at the line of her shoulders, straight and capable, and he thought that he had never in his life been as certain of a person's fundamental strength as he was of hers. He said, "I know you are not selling. I am just trying to figure out what he might try next." She turned from the stove then and looked at him, and her expression was direct and a little careful, as if she were about to say something she had been holding for a while. "You have spent a great deal of time on this, Joel," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed it like a change in the weather. "On my fence and my merchant accounts and my situation with Harwick. You have not said why." He held her gaze. "I think you know why." "I would rather hear you say it," she said. He turned his hat in his hands, looked down at it for a moment, and then looked back up at her. "Because I find that when I am not here, I am thinking about being here. And when I am here, I am not thinking about anywhere else. And I have not felt that way about any place or any person in a very long time, and I am not inclined to ignore it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she set the wooden spoon on the rest beside the stove and turned to face him fully, and she said, I liked my husband. I want you to know that. I was not unhappy in my marriage. I was not counting the days or wishing for something else. I was a content woman, and then I was a grieving one, and it has taken me a long time to figure out who I am now that I am neither of those things. I am not asking you to be anything in particular, he said. I know, she said. That is part of what makes this so disorienting. And she said it in a way that was almost wry, almost humorous, and he liked her enormously for it. He stood up from the table and she was 3 steps away from him, and the kitchen was small and warm and smelled like sugar and sage, and neither of them moved for a moment that felt long and full of possibility. Then she said, I think you should probably finish the fence post before the light goes. I probably should, he agreed. He went back out to the fence, but she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him work until the light did go, and he was aware of her the whole time, the way you are aware of the sun. The trouble with Harwick came to a head at the end of the first week of September, and it came in the form of a legal notice delivered to the house at 14 Sycamore Lane by the county clerk, a nervous young man named Pell who apologized 3 times while handing it over and could not quite meet Bessie's eyes. The notice claimed that the eastern boundary of the Fairchild property encroached by 12 feet on land that Harwick now claimed to own, based on a deed of sale he had evidently arranged with a surveyor from Harper County. It demanded that she remove the newly repaired fence and vacate the eastern 12 feet of her property or appear before the county magistrate in 30 days to contest the claim. Bessie read the notice twice, standing on the porch with the morning sun in her eyes, and then she handed it to Joel, who had arrived that morning with a cartload of firewood she had not asked for but had paid for and was deeply grateful for. He read it, and his jaw tightened. That survey is fraudulent, he said. I know it is, she said. I have the original land grant documents from 1874. The boundaries are clearly stated, but taking it to the magistrate will cost me money I do not have, and Harwick knows it. Joel folded the notice and handed it back to her and stood there for a moment thinking. He thought about the surveyor from Harper County and whether that surveyor was reputable or whether Harwick had simply paid for the conclusion he wanted. He thought about the land grant documents and who in Caldwell might be willing to look at them and speak on their behalf. He thought about the magistrate, a man named Clive Sherwood whom he knew slightly, not a corrupt man, but a careful one who tended to side with whoever had the most paper behind them. I know a man, Joel said, a lawyer in Wichita. His name is Thomas Reardon. I hauled his office furniture when he moved his practice 3 years ago, and he told me at the time that if I ever needed legal help I could come to him. I have never taken him up on it. Bessie looked at him. A lawyer in Wichita is 40 miles away. I can ride it in a day, Joel said, less if I push. Joel, she said, and then stopped. Say what you were going to say, he told her. You have already done so much, she said. The fence, the merchant accounts, the wood you brought this morning that I did not ask for. I do not want you to feel obligated to keep. I do not feel obligated, he said. I feel invested. Those are different things. She looked at him with those green eyes, and there was something raw and careful in them, the look of a person who had been disappointed enough times that hope felt dangerous. You should know, she said quietly, that I am beginning to count on you, and that frightens me because I have learned that counting on things is sometimes an excellent way to lose them. He stepped closer to her, not touching, just closer, and he said, I am not a man who starts things he does not intend to finish. If that counts for anything. She held his gaze for a long breath, and then she said, It counts for a great deal. Go to Wichita. He rode out before noon on his best horse, a long-legged bay gelding named Bishop, and he pushed hard and made Wichita before dark. Thomas Reardon was a lean, precise man in his 40s with spectacles and a thorough understanding of Kansas land law, and he listened to Joel describe the situation over a glass of bourbon in his study, and then asked 3 sharp questions, and then said, If she has the original land grant documentation, Harwick's fraudulent survey will not hold. But she needs someone to present the case properly, and the surveyor's credentials need to be challenged. He paused. I will come. You will come yourself, Joel said. I have been looking for an opportunity to bring a nuisance case against Harwick for 2 years, Reardon said, with the mild satisfaction of a man who has been patient for exactly as long as necessary. He has done this sort of thing before, to smaller claimants who could not afford to fight him. I have the documentation. This will serve nicely as a test case. He rode back to Caldwell the next morning with Reardon's agreement, and he found Bessie in the kitchen with the land grant documents spread on the table and a map pinned to the wall. And she looked up when he came through the door, and her face did something that undid him completely: relief and gratitude and something warmer and less definable, all at once. And she said, "He is coming." And he said, "He is coming." And she sat down in the kitchen chair and pressed both hands flat on the table and took a breath so deep he could see her shoulders move with it. "Good," she said. "Good." She stood up again immediately and went back to the stove, because she was not the kind of woman who sat still when there was work to do. And he sat at the table and watched her move through the kitchen with the particular grace of someone completely at home in their own competence. And he thought, with a certainty that surprised him not at all, that he was entirely and irreversibly in love with Bessie Fairchild. Thomas Reardon arrived in Caldwell 4 days later, drove directly to the county clerk's office, and spent an afternoon there examining documents. He then called on Magistrate Clive Sherwood, and the meeting lasted 2 hours. Joel did not attend any of these encounters. Reardon was perfectly capable without his help, and more importantly, Reardon's credibility would not be assisted by the presence of a hauler with no legal standing. But he stayed close, working on the last of Bessie's winter preparations with a focus that was part genuine usefulness and part the particular tension of waiting for something to break. It broke on a Thursday. Reardon appeared at the house on Sycamore Lane with the air of a man who had thoroughly enjoyed his afternoon. He sat at Bessie's kitchen table and accepted a cup of tea, and explained that the surveyor Harwick had hired turned out to have a history of flexible professional standards, and that Reardon had been aware of this for some time, and had brought the relevant documentation to Magistrate Sherwood, who had looked at the original Fairchild land grant and the fraudulent survey side by side, and found in favor of the original documentation without requiring a formal hearing. Harwick's claim had been dismissed. The fence could stay where it was. The eastern 12 feet belonged to Bessie Fairchild and to no one else. Bessie received this news with the composed steadiness she brought to everything, and then she thanked Reardon with genuine warmth and sent him away with 3 jars of preserves, and a handshake that Reardon accepted with visible respect. After he had gone, Joel waited for her to say something, and instead she walked out the back door of the house and stood in the yard with her face turned up toward the sky, which was the wide blue of a September afternoon, clean and enormous and indifferent. He went out and stood beside her. They were close enough that their arms almost touched. "He is not going to stop," she said. She was not frightened. She was simply accounting for reality. "Probably not immediately," Joel agreed. "But Reardon has a case against him now, a documented pattern. That changes his position." "And I have you," she said. She said it quietly and without particular inflection, and then she turned her head and looked at him, and there was a question in it. "You have me," he said. And then, because he was not a man who said things he did not mean and could not bear to leave the most important thing he had ever wanted to say unsaid, he said, "I would very much like you to continue having me, if that is something you want." She looked at him for a long, clear moment, and the wind moved in the sycamore tree at the corner of the yard, and somewhere down the lane a horse nickered, and Bessie Fairchild reached out and took his hand in both of hers, and he felt her fingers, warm and calloused from honest work, close around his. "It is something I want," she said. "It terrifies me, and it is something I want." "I know," he said. "I am a little terrified too." "Good," she said, and the ghost of a smile that was not quite a smile moved across her face. I would not trust a man who was entirely sure of himself." He laughed. It came out of him easy and real, the way a laugh should, and she looked startled by it for a second, and then she laughed too. A small, surprised sound that opened into something fuller and genuine. And they stood in the yard in the September light holding hands and laughing, and it was the best moment Joel had had in longer than he could remember. Through September and into October, the town of Caldwell adjusted to the fact of Joel Donovan and Bessie Fairchild. It adjusted the way small towns do slowly, and not without comment, and with the distinct discomfort of people watching someone refuse to behave the way they had decided she should behave. There were raised eyebrows and there was talk, and Mrs. Alden at the millinery shop said something pointed and unkind to her neighbor one afternoon that Bessie overheard and did not respond to, because she had decided that Mrs. Alden's opinion was not worth the effort it would take to care about it. There were also people who surprised her. Carl Meller and his wife, Margaret, invited Bessie to supper one Friday evening and treated her with plain, warm kindness, and Margaret Meller said, after 2 glasses of elderberry wine, that she thought Bessie was the most sensible woman in Caldwell and had thought so for years, and was sorry she had not said so sooner. The blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Davis who had known Robert Fairchild, touched his hat to Bessie whenever he saw her and once stopped Joel in the street to say, simply and directly, "She is good people. You know that, right?" And Joel said, "I know that," and Davis nodded with the air of a man confirming something he had needed to check. Harwick, for his part, went quiet, not gone, not vanished from the social landscape, but quiet in the way of a man temporarily recalibrating. Reardon had written him a letter on his professional stationery that Joel suspected was quite pointed in its legal language, and whatever it contained had apparently given Harwick reason for caution. He did not come to Sycamore Lane again. He did not speak to Bessie's merchants. He showed up at the church social in October with his hat pulled low and his wife on his arm, and looked at neither Bessie nor Joel for the duration of the evening, which was perhaps the most satisfying non-event Joel had witnessed in years. They went to that church social together, Joel and Bessie, and it was the first time they had appeared in a social setting as a clear pair, and people noticed. And most of them were gracious about it because gracious people are always more numerous than the other kind. They are simply quieter about it. Joel danced with her twice because she admitted she liked dancing and he was a passable dancer when he put his mind to it. And she was a good dancer, unhurried and precise the way she was precise about everything, following the music rather than fighting it. He felt her hand on his shoulder and his hand at her waist, and they moved together with the easy coordination of people who have learned each other well over weeks of suppers and fence posts and courthouse trouble. And he looked at her face while they danced, lit up with something he had not seen in her before, a frank, unguarded pleasure. And he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that turning that wagon around was the finest thing he had ever done. On a clear evening in late October, with frost on the ground and the sycamore tree in the yard gone yellow and half-bare, he asked her to marry him. He did not do it grandly. He did not have the kind of nature that reached for grand gestures. They were sitting on the porch after supper, wrapped in separate blankets against the cold, with 2 cups of coffee cooling in their hands, and the stars were extraordinary over the Kansas plain, dense and brilliant, the Milky Way a white smear across the dark from horizon to horizon. They had been talking about nothing in particular, the kind of talk that goes where it wants and does not need direction, and then he stopped talking for a moment and looked at the stars and said, "I would like to marry you, if you are willing." She did not answer immediately. She looked at the stars too, and he waited, comfortable in the wait, trusting her to arrive at her answer in her own time. "You know what you're taking on," she said eventually. "I know what I am gaining," he said. She turned her head to look at him. The porch light caught the silver of her breath in the cold air. "I am not easy," she said. "You know that by now." "I know," he said. "I am not easy either. I expect we will argue." "We will certainly argue," she said. "I am very good at arguing." "I have noticed," he said. "We will work it out." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "Yes, I am willing." He reached over and took her hand, the one not holding the coffee cup, and she let him. And they sat there on the cold porch under the enormous Kansas sky and drank their cooling coffee. And it was, Joel thought, exactly right. They were married in November at the courthouse, with Carl and Margaret Meller as witnesses and Thomas Reardon making the trip from Wichita because Bessie had written to him about it, and he said he would not miss it. The ceremony was short and sincere, and Bessie wore a dark blue dress with a white collar that she had made herself, and she looked so completely herself, calm and precise, and those green eyes steady and warm, that Joel forgot the words of his vow for a half-second and had to recover them, which made her lips press together in the way that meant she was suppressing a smile. And he told her afterward that she had done that on purpose, and she said she absolutely had not, and they both knew she was lying, and did not mind at all. The winter settled over Caldwell, quiet and heavy with snow, and Joel moved his few belongings into the house on Sycamore Lane, his boots and his tools and his good saddle and his 2 roan mares, and Bishop the bay gelding, who took up residence in the small stable at the back of the property, with the comfortable assurance of an animal that knew a good situation when it found one. The house was livelier with 2 people in it. Bessie had lived alone for 14 months and had developed the habits of a person who occupied her space in very particular ways, and Joel had lived alone for longer and had developed different but equally particular habits, and the first few weeks were an education in compromise and accommodation that was sometimes frustrating and occasionally genuinely funny and always interesting. She had opinions about where tools were stored. He had opinions about how early was a reasonable hour to begin making preserves. She won both arguments with a thoroughness that he respected even when he did not immediately agree with it. He was not idle in the winter. He ran his hauling business through the cold months, working contracts in Caldwell and the surrounding towns, and he brought home money that went into the household and helped stabilize the accounts that Bessie managed with the same careful precision she applied to everything. His reputation in the area was good, and with Bessie's merchant connections now added to his freight contacts, they were more financially stable by December than either of them had been separately in years. In the evenings by the fire, they read to each other. She had a small collection of books, practical things mostly, a natural history, a farming almanac, a medical guide, and one worn copy of poetry by John Keats that she had owned since she was 17, and that she claimed was purely sentimental, and from which she read aloud with more feeling than she would probably have admitted to. He found a copy of David Copperfield at the general store, and they read it over the course of 3 weeks, taking turns chapter by chapter, and she had opinions about every character and expressed them at length, and he listened and contributed, and it was the finest winter he had ever passed. He learned her. He learned that she was a person who needed half an hour of silence in the morning before she was ready to speak to anyone, and he gave that to her without comment or resentment. He learned that she slept with her hair loose and that she was a light sleeper, and that she sometimes woke in the night and lay very still thinking about things she did not always tell him, and that when he moved his hand to find hers in the dark, she always took it always, and her fingers tightened for a moment, and then she would sleep again. He learned that she cried exactly once in December, for reasons she explained precisely, standing in the kitchen with a matter-of-fact grief on her face, because it was the anniversary of the day Robert Fairchild had died, and she allowed herself one day a year to grieve what had been good and was gone, and she told Joel this openly, and he said, "Tell me about him." And she did, for an hour, and it was the kind of thing you only ask if you are entirely secure in what you have, and he was. She learned him too. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the second of 4 children, and that his father had been a fair man and his mother a practical one, and that he had drifted west at 19 because Missouri had felt too small, and he had been drifting in various degrees ever since, not quite finding the thing that would make him stop. She learned that he was a person who thought carefully before speaking, and who sometimes went very quiet when something troubled him, not sulking but genuinely processing, and that the right thing to do when he went quiet was to give him room and not press, and she was good at that because she respected silence as a form of thinking. She learned that he had strong feelings about the land rights issues that had been reshaping Kansas and the surrounding territories, about homesteaders being pushed off their claims, and about the broader injustices being done to Native peoples in the name of expansion, and that these feelings were not abstract but rooted in things he had seen with his own eyes, and she shared these feelings with the same rooted, particular conviction. By spring, they had settled into each other completely, the way rivers settle into their banks, not without having shifted things around in the process, but finally in the shape they were meant to be. The garden came back in April. Bessie put in 3 times as many dahlias as before, and added sweet peas along the fence rail, and planted a kitchen garden in the south corner of the yard with neat, straight rows of tomatoes and beans and summer squash. Joel built her a new cold frame for starting seedlings, and it was the crookedest thing he had built all year, and she told him so. And he told her it was fine, it worked. And she told him it looked like it had been built by a man who had done it with his eyes closed. And he told her she was welcome to build the next one herself. And she said she absolutely would, and she did, and hers was considerably straighter, and he was genuinely and wholeheartedly proud of her for it. In May, Bessie told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast. With the matter-of-fact directness she applied to most important things, and he sat very still for a moment with his coffee cup held in both hands, and then he set the cup down and looked at her across the table and felt something in his chest that was entirely new, not the displaced stone in the riverbed but something larger, something that altered the whole landscape, and his eyes were wet before he fully knew it, which was not something that happened to him often. And Bessie looked at him with those clear green eyes and said, "I thought you would be glad," with just a hint of uncertainty, and he said, "I am. I am very glad. I am more than glad. I do not have the word for what I am right now." And she reached across the table and put her hand on his, and he turned his hand over and held hers tight, and they stayed like that for a while. The summer of 1883 passed in a particular kind of fullness. Bessie's pregnancy was uncomplicated, and she managed it with the same resolute practicality she brought to everything, continuing to make her preserves and tend her garden and manage her accounts until late in her 3rd trimester, at which point she condescended to let Joel take over the heavier work with a graciousness that he appreciated because he knew it cost her. He hired a neighbor boy, 12-year-old Teddy Meller, Carl's nephew, to help with the stable and the yard, and Teddy was earnest and willing and occasionally catastrophically clumsy, and Bessie was patient with him in the way she was patient with everything she found genuinely worth caring about. Harwick had not made another move against them. There were rumors in July that he was trying to acquire land further west of town, which suited Joel fine, the further from Sycamore Lane the better. Thomas Reardon had written to say he was building his pattern case against Harwick's irregular surveying practices and expected to bring it before the state authorities before the year's end, and this too was good news, the particular satisfaction of a long patience finding its payoff. In late September 1883, Bessie gave birth to a son. He came into the world in the back bedroom of the house on Sycamore Lane with the help of Margaret Meller, who had experience with these things, and he announced himself with a fury and volume that were immediately recognizable as Fairchild traits. He was dark-haired and red-faced and absolutely perfect, and Joel held him in the first minutes of his life with the unsteady hands of a man who has just been given something more important than he knows how to contain. And he looked at Bessie, exhausted and luminous in the bed, and she looked back at him, and nothing needed to be said. They named him Robert Joel Donovan, for the man Bessie had loved and the man she loved now. And it was right in the way that things are right when they honor the truth of a life rather than hiding parts of it. Robert was a demanding infant and then a demanding child, with his mother's precision and his father's determination, which was a combination that would have been trying if it had not been so entirely charming. He had Bessie's green eyes and Joel's jaw and a laugh that seemed too large for his small body, and he liked the horses with a single-mindedness that delighted Joel and mildly alarmed Bessie, who said she was going to have to watch him or he would be climbing into the stalls before his second birthday, and she was not wrong. As 1883 moved into 1884 and Robert grew, and the business grew with it, the house on Sycamore Lane expanded its orbit. Joel had taken on a second hauling contract, this one a regular freight run between Caldwell and Wichita that kept him busy 2 days a week and paid better than anything he had hauled before. Bessie's preserve business had grown enough that she had hired a woman, Hannah Briggs, a widow of 32 who needed the work and who turned out to have an excellent instinct for jam, to help with production 3 days a week. They had repainted the house white, and the new paint covered the old peeling sections and gave the whole structure a restored, settled look that matched the way the life inside it felt. And the flowers were beautiful. The dahlias and sweet peas bloomed in their straight, precise rows. The kitchen garden produced abundantly, and the sycamore tree in the yard grew new leaves in the spring and shed them gold in the autumn. And under it, there was a bench that Joel had built somewhat crooked, in the spirit of the cold frame, where Bessie sat sometimes in the early morning with her first cup of coffee while the world was still quiet, looking at the garden she had made in a house she had nearly given up, and thinking whatever thoughts belonged to a woman who had come very close to leaving and had stayed. Joel found her there on a morning in April of 1884, the sycamore in first leaf and the dahlias just coming up, and he sat beside her on the bench with his own coffee and Bishop stamping in the stable 20 yards away, and Robert making small, cheerful sounds from his crib inside the house, and Caldwell waking up around them, slow and ordinary and entirely theirs. Bessie leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the early morning light without any particular need to speak. After a while she said, "I have been thinking about the East Field." "What about it?" he said. "I think we should plant it, properly I mean. Alfalfa for the horses, maybe, and a section of vegetables for market. If we put up a proper fence, a straight fence, we could keep it managed." He smiled at the straight fence comment. "I can put up a straight fence," he said, "if I work slowly." "You absolutely cannot," she said, but she was smiling too. "But I can help." He looked out at the East Field, the land that Harwick had tried to steal with a fraudulent survey, the land that belonged to them now without question or contest, its boundary defined by the fence that had started all of this. Good land, deep soil, the kind of land worth fighting for. "Alfalfa in the east section," he said. "Vegetables on the south side, near the creek tributary where the moisture will help." "Exactly what I was thinking," she said. "We think alike," he said. "We absolutely do not," she said. "You think like a hauler and I think like a farmer, and between the two of us we cover all the necessary ground." "That may be the most accurate thing you have ever said," he told her. She laughed, that surprised laugh he had been in love with since September of the year before, and he pulled her a little closer, and she let him, and the morning went on around them in all its plain, golden ordinariness. 2 months later, in June of 1884, Thomas Reardon's accumulated case against Augustus Harwick's land acquisition practices was submitted to the Kansas State Land Office in Topeka. The documentation was extensive, and the outcome, when it arrived in August, was significant. Harwick was required to relinquish 3 improperly acquired parcels, pay restitution to the displaced claimants, and was barred from future land transactions in the county pending a review. It was not perfect justice. It rarely was, and the claimants who had been forced off their land could not be entirely made whole by a legal ruling years after the fact. But it was a substantial accounting, and it sent a message that the kind of quiet, incremental theft Harwick had been practicing was not invisible and was not without consequence. He sold his Caldwell properties by the end of the year and moved his operation to another county, which was a type of solution if not a complete one. Joel watched him go with the sober satisfaction of a man who did not celebrate problems being moved rather than solved, but who could acknowledge that the particular corner of Kansas he lived in was measurably better for the absence. By Christmas of 1884, life on Sycamore Lane had settled into the particular richness of something genuinely built. The east field had been planted and fenced, the fence entirely adequate if not perfectly straight, and the alfalfa crop had come in well enough to feed the horses through the winter with surplus to sell. Hannah Briggs had become less an employee and more a fixture, arriving 3 mornings a week with her daughter, 7-year-old Clara, who sat at the kitchen table and drew pictures while the adults worked, and Robert, now 14 months old and mobile in the alarming way of toddlers everywhere, followed Clara with devoted and impractical admiration. Joel had expanded the hauling business to include a third contract. This one, a regular supply run to 3 homestead families south of town who could not easily get to market, and he charged them cost rather than profit because they were families with children and marginal margins, and Bessie did not tell him to charge more because she understood exactly why he did not. She did, however, add their names to the list of people who received a jar of preserves at Christmas, which she gave out with the brisk generosity of someone who calculated giving with the same precision she gave to everything else, and always concluded that more was correct. On a Friday evening in December, with snow on the ground and lamplight in every window and Robert asleep in his crib, and the house warm and smelling of pine and spiced apple preserves from the batch Bessie had put up that afternoon, Joel sat across from Bessie at the kitchen table where they had had every significant conversation of their marriage, and he looked at her, the dark chestnut hair, the green eyes, the capable hands wrapped around a mug of cider, and he said, with the simple, full certainty of a man who had arrived precisely where he meant to be, "I want to tell you something." She looked up at him. "You have my attention," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the morning I drove out to Sycamore Lane and you answered the door. And," she said, "I was going to load your things and drive you east and take my $3, he said. "That was the whole of my plan." "I know," she said. "I made it half a mile," he said. "I know that too," she said. "And I turned around," he said, "which was not something I planned, which was not something I could have explained in the moment in any particularly rational terms. I just knew that it was wrong to drive you east because the town had made it intolerable to stay. I knew something was worth trying." She was looking at him steadily, listening the way she always listened, completely without performance. "I want you to know," he said, "that it is the best half-mile I have ever traveled, the going and the turning both." She was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove made its low, steady sound. From the crib in the back room, Robert shifted and murmured and settled again. "Joel," she said. "Yes." "I want to tell you something too," she said. "Tell me," he said. "When you turned that wagon around," she said, "I was angry. I was genuinely angry with you for the first several minutes. I had made arrangements, I had packed properly, I had resolved myself." She paused. But underneath the anger there was this. She stopped and looked down at her cider and then looked back up at him. There was this feeling like something catching its breath, like a door I thought was closed turned out to be only latched, and I thought, who is this man who has presumed to have an opinion about my curtains? "I still stand by the curtains," he said. "You were right about the curtains," she said. "I hate that you were right about the curtains. I was not ready to go. I was running and I was calling it leaving, and they are not the same thing." She set the mug down and folded her hands on the table. "You gave me back my own home. You gave me back my own ground. She stopped again, and when she spoke her voice was very clear and very precise, the way it got when she was saying something that mattered enormously. "You are the reason I have this life. All of it. Robert and the East Field and Hannah coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the bench under the sycamore tree and all of it. You turned a wagon around half a mile out of town, and that small, stubborn, inexplicable act is the reason I have everything I have." Joel reached across the table and took both her hands, and she gave them to him, and he said, "You would have found your way. You are not a woman who gets permanently kept from what she deserves." "Maybe," she said. "But it would have taken much longer, and it would have been lonelier." She turned her hands so they were holding his rather than being held by him. "I am very glad you are not a man who finishes a job without questioning whether the job needed doing. That has not always been considered a virtue," he said. "It is one," she said firmly. He smiled at her, and she smiled back, that particular smile that had started as a ghost and had grown, over the course of a year and a half, into something full and unguarded and entirely her own. It was the smile of a woman who had stopped waiting to see if happiness would hold. In the spring of 1885, Bessie told him she was expecting again. This time he was not surprised, only glad, a warm, quiet gladness that sat comfortably in his chest, alongside everything else. They told Robert, who was now 18 months old and understood approximately none of it but responded to the general atmosphere of good feeling by laughing and banging a wooden spoon against his high chair tray. The second baby came in October, a daughter this time, with Joel's darker coloring and Bessie's green eyes, and a temperament that was quieter than Robert's and equally determined. They named her Clara Rose Clara for Hannah Briggs's little girl, who had become a fixture of the household and Robert's most devoted companion, and Rose for Bessie's mother, gone for 10 years, but remembered with the particular love of a daughter who had been well mothered. The night Clara was born, Joel held both his children in the lamplight of the bedroom, Robert on his left arm, uncertain about this new and demanding addition to his world, and Clara on his right, a small warm weight that fit against his shoulder as if she had always meant to be there. And Bessie watched him from the bed with her hair loose on the pillow and her face as open and undefended as he had ever seen it. And she said, "Look at this," in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, and he said, "I know," because he was looking and the words for it were not adequate. Carl Meller came by with a ham the following week, and Margaret Meller came with it and stayed for 2 hours and held Clara with the practiced ease of a woman who had held many babies and did not drop any of them. Hannah Briggs made a quilt of yellow and white squares that went on Clara's crib and stayed there for years. Thomas Reardon sent a letter from Wichita with his congratulations and a small but thoughtful gift of books, because he understood the household correctly. The town of Caldwell, by the autumn of 1885, had long since adjusted its attitude toward the Donovans of Sycamore Lane. Not universally, there was always a Mrs. Alden in every town, and she was still in hers, but broadly. Bessie was known as a woman of solid business sense and dependable goods, and Joel was known as a hauler of his word and a man of quiet but evident fairness. And together they were known as people who had built something good on that property at the edge of town, and who could be relied upon, which in a frontier community in 1885 was among the highest forms of social endorsement available. The East Field had produced 3 good crops by then. The alfalfa was sold to 3 ranches south of town and provided a reliable secondary income alongside the hauling and the preserves. The kitchen garden produced enough that Bessie had begun selling surplus vegetables at the Saturday market, where she set up a table with Hannah's help and conducted business with the brisk warmth of someone who genuinely liked the people she was talking to while having absolutely no patience for time wasting. Joel expanded the stable to accommodate a 3rd horse, a new acquisition, a steady gray named Patience, purchased at a fair price from a homesteader family who was moving north and needed to travel light. Patience turned out to have the steadiest temperament of any horse he had ever owned, which Robert approved of strongly, as he had taken to spending most of his free time in the stable, following his father around with the serious attention of a child cataloging information he fully intends to use. On a Sunday afternoon in November, with the children napping and the house quiet and the prairie stretched white and still beyond the yard, Joel and Bessie sat together on the bench under the sycamore tree wearing their coats, wrapped in a single blanket, which Bessie had pointed out was impractical, and Joel had pointed out was warmer than two separate blankets, a claim which she had contested and then conceded and then not mentioned again. The sky was a pale winter blue, and the bare branches of the sycamore made their familiar pattern overhead, and the horses moved quietly in the stable, and the house behind them was full of the life they had made. "I want to add a room," Bessie said. "To the house," he said. "Where else would I add a room?" she said, and he could hear the warmth in the dryness. "A proper parlor," he said, "with bookshelves. And a window seat," she said. "I have always wanted a window seat." "With a cushion," he added. "Absolutely with a cushion," she agreed. "A properly upholstered one, not something you have stuffed with feed sacks." "I would not stuff a window seat cushion with feed sacks," he said. "I am simply noting the possibility in advance," she said. He laughed and pulled her closer within the blanket, and she let him, settling her head against his shoulder with the ease of someone who has been doing this long enough that it is simply where she goes. He felt her warmth against his side and the weight of her head and the familiar particular rightness of being exactly here. "I am glad we have room to add a room," he said after a while. "That is not something I took for granted 18 months ago." "Nothing about this is something I take for granted," she said quietly. He pressed his lips briefly to her hair. She made a small sound that was neither word nor protest, just acknowledgement, and they stayed in the blanket on the bench under the bare sycamore in the white November afternoon, and the house held their children safely, and the east field held the promise of next spring's crop, and the road that led through Caldwell and out east toward the depot was very far from where they were sitting, 1/2 a mile and a year and a half and an entire life away. By the spring of 1886, Robert was 2.5, and Clara was 6 months old, and the new room was framed and half finished, built by Joel with the help of Davis the blacksmith and a carpenter named Hume who did good work and charged fairly, and who had built 3 rooms on 3 other properties on the east side of Caldwell in the past 2 years, which said something about the direction the town was growing. The window seat was included in the plans. Joel had ordered a cushion from a seamstress in Wichita, a very specific dark green that Bessie had described in a letter with the precision of someone who understood perfectly that if she left the color choice to anyone else, the result would be wrong. When the room was done and the cushion arrived and the bookshelves were in and the books arranged, Bessie's Keats on the top left, the natural history beside it, David Copperfield that had seen them through their first winter together, the almanac and the medical guide and a 1/2 new editions acquired over the course of their marriage. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment. "It is right," she said. "The cushion is the right color?" he asked. "Everything is the right color," she said. He stood beside her and looked at the room, the afternoon light coming through the new window, the window seat with its dark green cushion, the bookshelves full and orderly, the small square of rug on the floor that had come from a peddler's wagon the previous fall. It was a good room. It was a room that said, "We are staying. We are building. We are not going anywhere." He put his arm around her and she put her arm around him, and they stood in the doorway of the room they had made and looked at it together. "I should write to Vera," Bessie said, after a while. "I have been meaning to. She ought to see a photograph of the children." "Write to her this week," he said. "Tell her to visit." "She will not visit," Bessie said. "She is not a traveling sort of person, but she will appreciate the invitation." "Tell her anyway," he said. Bessie wrote to Vera the following Tuesday, sitting at the parlor desk in the new room with the afternoon light coming through the window, and Clara sleeping in the cradle. Joel had moved in from the bedroom, and Robert sitting at her feet with a collection of smooth stones he had gathered from the creek and was arranging in rows, straight rows, which Bessie noticed with a private, wordless satisfaction. In the letter, she told Vera about the new room and the east field and Hannah Briggs, and the window seat cushion, and Robert's stones and Clara's eyes and Joel's crooked fences and straight heart. And she told her that she was not coming to Colorado, and that she had not needed to. And she told her that the cousin she had been in those desperate months of late 1882, exhausted and frightened and almost gone, was someone she thought about with compassion but very little resemblance. Because the woman she was now had found the ground under her feet and intended to stand on it. She sealed the letter and set it aside to post in the morning, and she sat for a moment in the quiet of the new room while her children filled it with the ordinary sounds of being alive, and she thought about half a mile from the edge of Caldwell, on a road that ran east toward a depot and a freight car, and a life in Colorado that she had never needed. Half a mile that a man she had met that morning had driven before something turned him around, some stubborn, inexplicable insistence that the job he had been hired for was not the job that needed doing. She heard his boots on the porch outside, the familiar weight and rhythm of them, and then the front door, and then his voice speaking to Robert in the low, easy way he spoke to the boy, as if the 2-year-old were a person whose thinking was worth taking seriously, which he was. She heard Robert's response, high and certain and not entirely comprehensible, and she heard Joel's quiet laugh, and Clara stirred in her cradle and made a small sound, and the sycamore tree moved in the wind outside the new window. She closed her eyes for just a moment, the way she sometimes did when she wanted to fix something completely, the sound and the warmth and the particular weight of what was real, and then she opened them again and stood and went to the doorway. And Joel was in the hall with Robert on his hip and his hat still on his head, and he saw her in the doorway of the new room, and his face did what it had been doing since the first winter they had known each other, that simple, full brightness that he did not try to contain. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. "How is the room?" he asked. "As it should be," she said. He came toward her down the hall, and she stepped aside to let him in. And he stood in the new room with Robert pointing at the bookshelves and naming things he could not yet read but already understood were important. And Bessie went to the cradle and picked up Clara, who settled against her shoulder with the boneless trust of a small person entirely sure of her welcome. And the late afternoon light lay across the dark green cushion and the bookshelves and the rug and all four of them. And outside the sycamore tree made its sound, and the east field waited for spring, and the road to the depot was exactly where it had always been, 6 miles east and a whole other life away. "I need to tell you something," Joel said. She looked at him. "I drove past the spot today," he said, "the half-mile mark. I was coming back from the Hendricks contract and the road goes right past it. I do not always notice it anymore, but today I noticed." "What did you think?" she said. He looked at her across the room, across their children, across the afternoon light. "I thought about what was on the other side of that moment," he said. "What was waiting if I kept going?" He paused. "And then I thought about what was on this side of it if I turned around." She held his gaze. Clara made a soft sound against her shoulder. Robert had climbed down and gone back to his stones and was arranging them in a precise row against the baseboard. "No comparison," he said. She nodded, and her throat was a little full, but she was Bessie Fairchild Donovan and she did not cry easily, and instead she said, in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely true, "No comparison whatsoever." He crossed the room and kissed her forehead, and she leaned her head briefly against his chest, and he smelled like road dust and leather and horses and home, and it was everything. Later, after supper and after the children were in bed, they sat in the new parlor room by lamplight, Bessie reading Keats aloud, unhurried, with more feeling than she would have admitted to, and Joel watching her face while she read, because he liked watching her face when she was doing something she loved, and the lamp made everything warm and the sycamore moved outside in the dark, and it was simply their life. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of life that a man earns not by deserving it, but by turning around when something tells him to, and following whatever it is That tells you the half-mile behind you matters more than all the miles ahead. It was theirs, and it would stay theirs, and the road east had long since grown over with prairie grass in the imagining of it. And in its place there was a bench and a garden and 2 children, and a window seat, and a woman who kept her curtains and finally had every reason to. And that was more than any of it had ever needed to be.